Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
The United States has pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, but there's been pushback by the nation's governors. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. We're getting out. With those words, President Donald Trump announced that the U.S. was withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. It was a decision that reflected his promises on the campaign trail last year. But at least 10 governors have not only denounced the move, but have joined what is called the United Climate Alliance. The Delmarva region, those include the governors of Delaware and Virginia. Maryland Governor Larry Hogan has said that he would not have withdrawn from the agreement. In addition, there's been a push for solar and wind power in the region as many communities struggle to keep ahead of the rising sea level. In our studio this morning is Mike Prattle. He has been with the Wicomico Environmental Trust, also currently with Lower Shore Land Trust. Welcome to the program.
Glad to be here.
So let me ask you, so overall, what do you think is the significance of the U.S. decision to withdraw from the agreement?
Well, I think it is a very important decision in a very significant direction that the federal government is going. I don't think it's going to have a tremendous impact on us here in Maryland, at least in the short run and probably in the long run. I mean, that's the simple answer. I have to admit a bias. I feel that the Paris Agreement or the Paris Compact, whatever you want to call it, was a very, very well thought out approach to dealing with a very complex problem. And it just happened on when, while the Paris talks were going on in late 2015, I was teaching a course in climate change, so I had the opportunity to actually review 3 different drafts of the agreement before it was finalized in December of 2015. And I thought the process was just absolutely fascinating. As an attorney interested in this issue, I thought it was a stroke of genius, basically, the way they had done it, because the group, the IPCC group, and the governments that were supporting it, the 195 countries around the world, have been meeting every year. I mean, it was called COP21, Conference of the Parties, 21st conference, but a lot of the other conferences had been unsuccessful because of issues between the big countries and the small countries, the countries that had caused the problem and the countries were being looked at to resolve the problems, that sort of thing. So what they did was they came up with an approach, which was actually spearheaded to a large extent by the United States, by the Obama administration and Secretary Kerry, to say, okay, we're not going to have an agreement as such. What we're going to do is ask each country what they can do and what they intended to do. And the key to the whole thing, which isn't really talked about a whole lot, was something called INDCs. Which stands for Intended Nationally Determined Commitments. That is, each country was asked by, I think, October 1st of 2015 to tell the Paris people who were running the show what they thought they could do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and how they were going to go about doing it. And everybody filed an INDC, and you could actually go online today and still see the INDC that was filed by 195 different countries. And under a certain pattern, although some of them were 2 pages long and some of them were 42 pages long, and the United States came in and said, we think we can reduce greenhouse gases by 26 to 28% by 2030, and this is how we intend to do it. And then they divided into the various sectors of the economy, the energy sector, under the Clean Power Plan that the Obama administration had proposed, and the transportation sector, both cars and trucks and aircraft, and the agricultural sector and that sort of thing. So each one they had outlined a plan. Now the reason they did it this way was because they had not been able to reach a uniform proposal on how all the nations were going to do it, because different nations have different economies and different abilities and what have you. And they didn't want to pin people down to a particular approach, so they said, well, what approach would you suggest? How do you think you could do it? Also, these things are non-binding, and some of the environmental folks were upset because they felt there should be a binding agreement, but you can't bind people because, frankly, I mean, just look at the U.S., each one of these sectors would require laws and regulations to deal with them, a lot of which haven't been passed yet and may never be passed. So this was the intended commitment. This is what we were going to try to do, but they couldn't commit to do it. So anyway, I thought it worked extremely well, and all 195 countries bought into it at that time, which was just incredible. I mean, frankly, it's the only thing in the history of the world where we've had consensus of the entire world towards a common goal, which is to reduce greenhouse gases so that the rise in temperature would be less than 2.0 centigrade, and with a goal and ambition, they put it, of 1.5% centigrade.
No, so one of the things that when Trump announced that he was going to withdraw, he said, a quote from him, he says, the same nations asking us to stay in the agreement are the countries that have collectively cost America trillions of dollars through tough trade practices and in many cases lax contributions to our critical military alliance. He obviously is tying both trade and the military contribution, particularly to NATO, to this. What's your reaction to that? Do you see these being as tied?
No, the interesting thing is he spoke very little about the science or very little about climate change as such. He didn't deny that there's a problem. He just tried to make it a global issue and bring it into NATO or bring it into all the other issues that he has in foreign affairs, which I thought was a sort of a way of avoiding dealing with what it's really all about. But I mean, the funny thing is that there's been a lot of criticism of China and India and what have you. They are actually ahead of their commitments that they made. They're doing better than we are. And if anybody's lagging at this point under the commitments we made, it's the United States.
So Trump coming into office, withdrawing not only his support, obviously, for the agreement, but obviously support for, say, federal government actions anyway that might, say, for instance, get us to the goal of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. What kind of impact does the new administration have on the kind of goals that we set for ourselves under the Obama administration?
Well, I think it's outrageous that we have said we're no longer going to seek these goals. At the same time, most of us believe that the federal government has a very limited role in actually accomplishing these things. I mean, the interesting thing, as you mentioned earlier, is not only are the states, where most of the action is at this point, but most of the states are, including the Republican states, by the way, are pursuing the goals that have been set out for them. But probably even to a greater extent, industry has very much converted over to a renewable energy future. And the federal government isn't compelling it at this point. The federal government is, if anything, lagging behind industry. I mentioned before we went on the air, I just finished reading a book by Michael Bloomberg and Carl Pope called Climate of Hope, where that basically the whole book makes that point, that the federal government has a very limited role to play here, because in the past, the federal government, especially under the Obama administration, and here in Maryland under the O'Malley administration, for instance, were pushing very hard on some of these things. But now the train is moving, and it's like the federal government, get out of the way and let us do what we're trying to do. I mean, I was talking to some environmentalists about this the other day. We think probably the major drawback, if you will, is the impact of, and it's not directly tied to the agreement, but the impact if for instance, if NOAA, which has been the federal agency which has been doing a lot of the research, if they are no longer permitted to do the research, obviously not having the data will be a drawback for accomplishing some of these things. But industry is all doing their own research now. I mean, even ExxonMobil and the big oil companies are all on board now, and they're all heading for a renewable energy future. So the federal government isn't going to do much to stop that from happening. By
the way, what do you make of this new group? I guess it's United Climate Alliance. There's at least 10 governors, I think, that's joined it. These states, by the way, represent about 15%, I guess, of the country's emissions, and 2 of them, by the way, are Republican governors. What do you make of that organized effort? And apparently there are like a lot of non-state members as well.
Well, I mean, it's funny because the Republican Party has always believed in states' rights and that states should, call the shots of these things. And now that states are saying, okay, we're doing. Matter of fact, I think Governor Jerry Brown of California, I think, is in China today negotiating climate change directly with the Chinese government. They're basically saying if Trump's not going to do it, then we'll do it ourselves. And as you probably know, Maryland has been a part of the so-called RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative of 8 states in the Northeast. So we're a big part of trying to deal with these issues, which have really nothing directly to do with the Paris agreements and have everything to do with it, in the sense that, as Bloomberg and Pope are saying, most of the action is at the state level. I mean, when I taught my course of climate change, I was sort of pleasantly surprised to see that just during the 8 years of the O'Malley administration, there were 17 new environmental laws passed, virtually all of which had to do with climate and with auto emissions and with various aspects of it. And I mean, most of the work has been done in recent years at the state level, and the federal government has been somewhat of a bystander on the thing.
By the way, explain, by the way, the RGGI agreement.
Well, I don't pretend to be an expert on it, but
sort of broad outlines.
It deals with swapping credits for pollution, or for greenhouse gases, and states actually pay into a fund and get certain credits back, depending on how much they are able to reduce or how much they have to use additional emissions. And and I mean, basically, it's sort of a mini government, a body that would, since the federal government has not been a good leader in some of this stuff, these 8 states got together and said, we all believe that climate change is a serious problem, and we believe we can work together so that places that have a need for high emissions can buy credits actually from places that can get by reducing their emissions.
So how do you assess, by the way, Governor Larry Hogan? He obviously has not joined the alliance, but he has said that he would not have withdrawn from the agreement. And I believe a spokesman I read said that he's been strong on environmental issues during his tenure. How do you assess where he is? Because some environmentalists say, gee, he should speak out against the Trump administration and what they're doing. Obviously, he's not done that, even though he did not support or come out vocally for Trump.
Well, I think Governor Hogan has been a master at trying to be a centrist in a non-centrist world. I mean, it's virtually impossible to do that, and he seems to have succeeded so far. Most of the environmental community aren't real happy with him for his failure to provide leadership. He did veto the RPS revision, which is renewable power supply provision last year, which was overridden by the legislature. So he's been, to some extent, I say, trying to take a middle-of-the-road position, trying not to criticize Trump, but yet making it clear he doesn't side with Trump. So, whether he can get away with it until the next election remains to be seen. We have a very strongly environmentally conscious legislature, and he is not certainly not initiating many of these things, although he takes credit for some of the things that the legislature does, which is typical of a governor. And, he's certainly not as bad as he could be. He's certainly not as good as he could be. I'll put it that way from my standpoint.
Now, to be fair, by the way, just recently, I guess, he's been elected chair of the Chesapeake Executive Council, and they certainly voted as a resolution to support the money that goes to the cleanup, the federal support. I mean, he does seem to be moving certainly in that direction.
Well, even Congressman Harris is on board with the Chesapeake Bay initiative. So, I think that's sort of a third rail that nobody is willing to go against, and hopefully we'll get the funds we need to continue the Chesapeake Bay cleanup. And and Hogan has been strong on that. So I think he deserves some credit that he is willing to at least face political reality and be a leader on things that where there's a strong consensus in the state to support those things.
So looking at Delmarva, we've got at least, I guess, a number of projects, both solar, for wind, for example. What are we seeing here? I know that you've been involved with some solar activity as well, but is the Eastern Shore going to become a hub for wind or for solar? What are we looking at?
Well, let me back up and say, I say I taught a course called Climate Change on Delmarva, and I had hoped at the time to bring in the folks from the various counties to talk about what the various counties were doing and that sort of thing. And I was somewhat surprised or perhaps appalled to find that most of them are doing nothing at all. And, they have something in their comprehensive plan to talk about, gee, we're really concerned about sea level rise and whatever, but very few of them are implementing any sort of plan. So there's been very little done in the municipal county level. Although Mayor Jake Day in Salisbury has a very extensive plan, and I actually had him teach a class, and he came in very proudly with all his charts and maps and ideas that he's doing in Salisbury. So, and St. Michael's is doing some things. At Steig Island has a great 4-option plan for dealing with sea level rise there. So there are isolated situations. But again, most is being done outside the governmental level, if you will. And wind and solar obviously are the two big renewable energy things that are in the process. I've been working with a group called Maryland Sun, which is setting up co-ops in various states and counties to deal with solar panels on the roofs of residential properties, and there's now a new community effort, so you can put solar panels. Actually, some of the churches now are putting panels on, and since the churches can't take advantage of the tax benefits since they're tax exempt, what they're doing is getting members of the congregation to actually buy the panels and get the tax write-off, and the church gets the benefit of having the panels, and then when it's all written down, then they donate it to the church, which is a great idea. But I think most people feel that the real power is in wind, ultimately. I mean, solar is good and solar is necessary, at least in the short run, because you can put up solar panels very, very quickly. And the price of the panels has reduced by 80 or 90% over the last 10 years. But wind is where the action is. And the Public Service Commission in Maryland, just within the last 3 or 4 weeks, has issued an order, which I just recently reviewed, which I think is an incredibly strong and smart document. Because what it says is not only, well, there were 2 companies that were competing to build offshore wind turbines. And they were competing with each other, and the Public Service Commission says, we'll approve both of you. You could either work together or you could work independently. The federal government has set aside acreage in the offshore area, 12 to 26 miles, I think, out from Ocean City and the shore to, you could actually put enough wind turbines there to, they compute, to power about 40% of the total population of the eastern United States. So it's quite a it's quite an ambitious array. But under the Public Service Commission order, the approvals are contingent on job creation, and they actually have to create. There's a very specific number of construction jobs and then long-term jobs. I think it's like 7,000 jobs, and they all have to be in Maryland. So, in other words, these companies are permitted to build their turbines on the condition that they'll invest X billion dollars and that they'll hire 7,284 people or whatever the total is. Now, a lot of the construction is going to be done in the Port of Baltimore, and some of the old factories that are now closed up are going to be reopened to build wind turbines. And here on the Eastern Shore, we have a tremendous opportunity to be the East Coast hub, because there's very little wind so far being developed on the East Coast. California is by far the largest site of wind in the United States today. Surprisingly, the number 2 state by far is Texas, which of course you always think of as being the oil capital of the country, which it is, but there are more wind turbines there than any place other than California. But there are very few on the East Coast so far. We've lagged behind, but a number of us see this as a golden opportunity for Maryland, and especially Delmarva, to become the East Coast hub of a lot of the wind activity for the future. So. And there actually is going to be legislation put in next year to try to increase the RPS, the renewable power, the renewable energy portfolio, up to 50% by 2030, which is rather ambitious, but it's going to motivate people, if it passes, to really move forward more quickly with the turbines and also with solar.
As a matter of fact, you were talking about California. They want renewables, 100% renewables by 2025, something like currently now they're like at 56%. Are you surprised at the rapid contribution, at least at this moment, that solar and wind are having? I mean, I remember actually moderating a panel probably not 7-8 years ago, and we were looking at it, and oil by far has the most energy per BTU. But it seems as if at least these 2 particular alternatives seem to be increasing at a surprising rate.
I think everyone is surprised, and partly it's economics. Okay, I mean, coal is out of business because coal can't compete. Natural gas to some extent is at least a short-term palliative, although all this fracking controversy has thrown up a little bit of roadblock there, and there's the pipelines and all the Exxon, the Keystone XL stuff and all that. But I think everyone is pleasantly surprised at how quickly this is advancing. And I say, and especially, I mean, from my perspective, it's surprising how quickly and how overwhelmingly industry has moved in the direction of adopting these goals, at least. And to some extent, I mean, some of the largest companies in the world, Exxon and Apple and those, they're talking about 95 to 100% renewables, by 2010. I mean, by 2020. So it's everyone is moving very, very quickly. And when you think about it, I mean, corporate planning, you have to look at the future, and these corporations aren't stupid. And even though some people that represent them may be, and they are seeing the handwriting on the wall. And with the price factors, I mean, there are more people today working in the wind and solar industries than in oil, gas, and natural gas combined, which is just incredible. So I mean, it certainly is the wave of the future, and they recognize it. Oh, and the other industry that people don't talk about a whole lot is the insurance industry. But when you think about it, I mean, insurers are the ones who are really on the risk for all this sea level rise and all this damage that's going to be caused by the effects of climate change. And I mean, they are in a royal panic, and they are pushing a lot of this stuff because they're giving favorable rates to people that are moving to renewables. So there's a lot of things going on in the economy that apparently Mr. Trump is oblivious to, but that are going to happen whether he understands it and supports it or not.
As a matter of fact, talking about companies, I mean, there's 3M, Bank of America, General Electric, for example, Goldman Sachs, Pacific Gas and Electric, amongst others. I mean, there's a whole slew of companies.
I think it's funny, the General Motors. Yeah. I mean, 20 years ago, as you know, General Motors was slowing down electric cars because they were afraid it was going to hurt their business. Now, General Motors is 50% renewables, which is just incredible. That I mean, that says a mountain to me that the leading oil producers are saying oil is basically on the way out. And the fact that I thought it was interesting that Mr. Tillerson, who was the CEO of ExxonMobil for the last 8 or 10 years, opposed the president's initiative to get out of the Paris talks. So that says something to me too.
So one of the things we haven't talked about is the ultimate impact of climate change has been sea level rise.
Right.
How do you see the local communities trying to deal with this? I mean, obviously, they can go green and that sort of thing, but the water's still rising. I mean, it's, and I did a piece a few years back in which Lewis, for example, in Delaware, has done a lot of planning, trying to figure it out, although projections look like the whole swaths of what is now coastline in Delaware could disappear. Ocean City's got these bulkheads which, that rises enough and you can see these homes, underwater. How do you see local officials reacting to trying to deal at least with the effects, even if they're not going green?
Well, as I said earlier, I'm somewhat disappointed that they seem to be looking the other way. And I mean, as I think you've been to my house, Don. I live, on the Nanticoke River. I mean, we live in a house that's 130 years old, and if I had to bet, I would bet that the house isn't going to be there another 20 years, even though it was raised 4 feet off the ground. I mean, we had almost 3 feet of water when Sandy came along 5 years ago. And we used to have water on the lawn maybe twice a year. Now it's maybe once a month. 3 weeks ago I had 6 inches of water covering almost my entire lawn, which is 100 feet back from the river. So it's a little frightening, and it's certainly happening. And I don't see the local governments really responding. I mean, they're really not. They're giving lip service to it. Frankly, they don't want to spend tax dollars doing something that's going to affect future generations. That's what it comes down to. I mean, if I'm county executive, I have a choice between rebuilding the tree-ready roads or spending a huge amount of money to the remedial steps necessary to shore up the shorelines for something that, even if I'm convinced it's going to happen in 10 or 20 years, it's not going to happen on my watch, and therefore I'm not going to spend my political capital today. And you know, I mean, I'm disappointed that there doesn't seem to be enough citizen push toward doing that. Just this past week, the local newspaper did a thing on climate change and the Paris Agreement and what have you, and more than half of the people that responded said, "Well, I don't think it's a big deal," or "I think it's going to cause too many jobs," or "It's going to," you know, there's not a lot of support at this point among the decision makers, and I mean the environmental community is pretty much united in saying this is something that's serious and something we have to deal with, but it's rather difficult to get to turn the battleship around, if you will, and get it to move in the direction of spending the money necessary to make the changes that are necessary, that are going to be necessary.
So if people own like a house like yours, and as a matter of fact, I went out to Dorchester County, and actually there were houses that were obviously built up on, you know, concrete stilts, as it were, but you could see that there were whole swaths of the area that had basically gone underwater, that houses were being lost. Is it a good idea that maybe is the strategy now that we just got to simply retreat? I mean, accept the fact that this is going to happen. I mean, even as we try to go green.
Well, I say it's funny. I mean, one of the smartest or the most serious approaches to this was done by the National Park Service about Aztec Island, and they did the calculations to show what's going to happen there, and they came and they had all sorts of public meetings and whatever to talk about 4 different alternatives. Do we just walk away from the whole thing? Do we move back? Do we build up sand dunes? You know,
right.
And none of them are good solutions. But I mean, I hate to say it's a failure of political leadership, but it really is, I guess, in the sense that there's no one who is talking and doing the things necessary to mobilize citizens to take the problem seriously at this point. Part of it's, you can blame it on Trump, you can blame it on Hogan, you can blame it on all the elected officials, because nobody is taking it as seriously as they probably should.
Well, you know, is it like Delaware? Now, Delaware has taken it. The state of Delaware has taken it very seriously with plans, and then they're working with the folks along the coast. I mean, they seem to have an active state involvement. Where's Maryland in this? And Hogan has not been there forever. We had a Malley and a Democratic-controlled legislature.
I mean, our legislature's done a lot. But they haven't done a lot with sea level rise, because frankly there's not a whole lot that can be done without huge cost. And so I mean, everybody's or people who have taken it seriously have planned for the future, but very few people have invested for the future. And you know, I don't know what it's going to take to force people to. There was an interesting. This is a change of subject, but not really. In England, 10 years ago, of course, you know, England is not only an island, but they're by far their largest city. London is based on a tidal river, you know, so they took it very seriously, and they hired a guy, Lord Stern, who was the head of the Bank of London, and he's not an environmentalist, he's an economist, and said, we want you to tell us whether A, there's a problem, and B, if so, what we should do about it. And he spent like 2 years and millions of dollars and did an 800-page study, and he basically said that Great Britain should be spending between 1% and 2% of their gross national product to shore up the coastline, especially the Thames River and all that kind of stuff. Or else, by 2050, we will be spending between 5% and 8% of our gross national product remediating all the damage that's going to be done. You know, and apparently the Blair administration did move very firmly. They put up big gates on the Thames River and that sort of thing, and I haven't been over there in recent years, but so you know, I mean, there's a lot that can be done, but you really need somebody to take hold and say, what are our options here, and what's going to cost? And at this point, I don't think anybody has been willing to do that. And Maryland's sort of an interesting state, because the center of the state, as you know, is quite liberal, I guess, you know, the 4 or 5 areas that, but the outlying areas, including the Eastern Shore, are relatively conservative, and you know, and resent the regulations that are imposed upon them by Annapolis or by the state legislature. So there is this political tugging and pulling, and so far nobody has been able to, I guess, develop the consensus necessary to really come to grips with the future.
Well, let me ask you as we sort of wrap up, because I've actually asked the governor about this in a different context, but is part of the problem in terms of the state doing more in terms of funding and so on and so forth, because that's where the money is, as it were. is it that the political heart of this state is in the cities? It's not on the Eastern Shore, and so therefore, well, we're going to do lots of things for the environment, like mass transportation, for example, and you guys out on the shore here, well, we'll get around to you. I mean, for instance, we had the defeat of Norman Conway, who at one point was chair of the Appropriations Committee of the House of Delegates. Major loss in terms of influence, anyway. Is there an unequal balance here when it comes to interest in doing, well, we're going to spend all this money on rapid transit in Baltimore, but you guys out here, well, maybe not so much.
Well, you're saying the same thing I'm saying, but maybe in a slightly different way. You would need somebody from the outlying areas to fight for these as their priorities, and I mean, even though we were very supportive of Mr. Conway, I mean, that was not seen as a priority of his constituents. They didn't send him to Annapolis to get money to take care of climate change. They sent him to get money for education, for hospitals, for the university, but not for the types of things that we may believe are necessary in the future.
So you put some of the blame on the folks on the Eastern Shore in terms of actually doing something.
Well, I say it's just not a priority for them, and at this point, and I don't know how we move it to priority unless there's a. It's almost like things have to get really bad before people start to wake up and say, hey, we got a problem here. And it may be too late when they do.
We've been speaking with Mike Prettle. He's been with the Wicomico Environmental Trust, is currently with the Lower Shore Land Trust.
Actually, I'm with the Nanticoke Watershed
Oh,
Alliance
currently. Okay, currently, okay. But that's not what you say on your land.
No, well, that's old. I used to be on the Land Trust Board. Now I'm on the Nanticoke. I'm president of the Nanticoke Watershed Alliance.
Okay. Anyway, and we've been talking about the climate change, and we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
Always happy to do so.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Rank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on PAC 14. For the Delmarva Today schedule, visit pac14.org or view the latest issue of the Daily Times.